Get started and introduce myself and Dr. Fitzpatrick. So I'm Livia Shriki. Welcome, everybody. So we began this company to help clinicians navigate difficult and complicated situations in treatment using evidence-based treatments. And as we did this, we realized that at times clinicians don't have easy access to the most recent research and data. And so we decided to start a research-based corner or talks where researchers can present their work in a way that's easily accessible to clinicians in the field, and so clinicians can apply this in their work. So I'm really excited and honored to have Dr. Fitzpatrick here today, discussing her research on a novel model for borderline personality disorder. I'll just say a little bit about you, Skye. So Dr. Skye Fitzpatrick is currently a faculty member at York University in Canada, where she leads the TULIP lab that focuses on optimizing interventions for individuals who struggle with life-threatening behaviors, borderline personality disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And Dr. Fitzpatrick, I believe you're particularly right now focusing on conjoint and dyadic interventions for these for people with PTSD or BPD and their loved ones. So you've received numerous awards over the years and have trained at really prominent institutions like Ryerson University, UW, and Rutgers University. And I'm really excited to have you here today. Before I hand over the floor to you, I'm just going to use 30 seconds to go over some logistics. So we're using, in case you probably noticed that the format's a little different today than our usual talk. So we're using Zoom webinars for today, and instead of the usual chat box that will where people can pose questions, we're having people pose their questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen in the toolbox. And the cool thing is you can also upvote other people's questions, so you don't have to pose the same question a few times, and you can kind of like it, like you do it with other apps, and that would it'll float to the top so that we know to pay attention to those questions. If there are any technical difficulties, you can email us at our general email, info@ebpne.com, or text Ronnie in the phone number that was provided in your registration confirmation email. You can also put it in the Q&A box if there's an issue that you can't get an answer to, and Ronnie will answer through that. If you're seeking CE credits, please make sure that the name and information you signed in with today matches the information you registered with and that you want on your CE certificate, and that you're here for the full hour today. After this hour, where Dr. Fitzpatrick talks about her research, she and I will have more of a kind of one-on-one fireside conversation, if you will, where we'll focus a bit more on her work. And if there are any big questions that were left unanswered, we will try to answer them there as well. And that will be provided, a recording of that will be provided later this week. And a recording of this talk will also be provided. And with that, I'm going to be quiet and let you hand the floor over to you.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And thank you all for coming. This is honestly the most exciting thing, getting to talk about the things that you're obsessed with and have people actually listen to you. I can't imagine anything more reinforcing than that. So thank you so much for coming and for having me. Okay, if you can't see that, hopefully somebody will just interrupt me and tell me, but I'm going to presume that you can. So, all right, so my name's Dr. Skye Fitzpatrick, as Olivia said. I'm going to start, I'm not going to define BPD to you folks. I'm going to presume that you know what BPD is, but I'm going to just do a quick framing and how we think about it. And then I want to talk a little bit about the emotional models of BPD that have been really foundational, I think, for a lot of us, especially those of us who practice DBT, so namely the biosocial model, and talk about what is working based on the research in those models and what might not be working. And then I want to sort of pivot and think about interpersonal problems and relational problems as a centerpiece of BPD. And that will lead me into talking about the bias model, which is the model that myself and my colleagues have developed. I'm really hoping that I will have time to talk about intervention implications and give you at least a preview of some of the stuff that we've been developing based on the bias model, because I think it kind of puts this model into more of a clinical context. So that's where I'm hoping to go. First, just to say, yes, so I direct a lab at York in Toronto called the Tulip Lab, which is really focused on optimizing interventions for BPD and PTSD, sometimes using DBT, and more recently using kind of DBT-informed conjoint methodologies that are really leveraging relationships and the healing power of relationships to help people recover from these conditions. So that's the context. All right, so BPD in hopefully like 5 seconds rather than 30. All I really want to say about BPD is we know there's the 9 diagnostic criteria, but typically, especially if you're working from the biosocial model, you might group them into these 5 domains of dysregulation, right? So relationship or interpersonal dysregulation, emotions, behavioral dysregulation, which is where we see the impulsive behavior, identity-based dysregulation, and cognitive dysregulation, where we might see dissociation, paranoid ideation, things like that. So Marsha Linehan's work in reframing BPD as an emotional disorder has been, I mean, completely foundational, earth-shattering, critical in how we started to, and how the field started to think about BPD in a more behaviorally specific, and I would say non-pejorative way. I think this emotional model of BPD has been so central in destigmatizing the disorder. And most of you are probably quite familiar with the model, so I won't belabor it, but the key idea is that BPD is an emotion dysregulation disorder, that all the diagnostic criteria of BPD are accounted for by emotion dysregulation in some way. And emotion dysregulation in the research literature is quite variable in how it's defined, but in the biosocial model, it's quite precise and clear. So the first thing I want to highlight is this idea of people with BPD having high baseline emotion. So at their baseline, they have elevated emotion. That wasn't actually part of the original biosocial model, but it's kind of worked its way in over the years. The real core components are that once something happens to provoke emotion, people with BPD have that higher sensitivity, so their lower threshold for emotional responding, and they have bigger reactivity, so larger changes in emotion from their baseline. So the magnitude of increase in their emotion is theoretically larger than it would be for somebody without BPD. That's actually probably the most studied form of emotion dysregulation out there, and I'm going to talk about what the results look like on that in a minute. So that theoretically leads to this large emotional response that is also prolonged because people with BPD have this slow return to baseline. They're less likely to have emotional recovery as quickly as other people, so emotions stick around for longer. And on top of that intense, long-lasting emotion, they theoretically have problems regulating or modulating their emotion. So that is what I'm going to refer to as emotion dysregulation, right? Like all of these components, and probably a lot of you know this and have explained this to your clients. So these are the components in the biosocial model and the ones that have been really tested in the research literature. So if you go back to the 5 domains of BPD, what the biosocial model really does is plop out the emotion dysregulation domain and put it in the middle of the circle. It basically says all these other symptoms are caused by emotion dysregulation. We can't have stable relationships when our emotions are going all over the place. We engage in destructive behavior to regulate those emotions. Emotions being labile disrupts our identity formation. And all of that makes sense. It's a very compelling narrative. It's quite logical. And so the first thing I really want to say is that thinking about BPD as an emotional disorder does make sense for a lot of reasons. One is the research is very robust at this point that people with BPD do have elevated negative emotions at baseline. With self-report, parasympathetic indices, sympathetic indices, doesn't matter. Across all those studies, the research is quite clear that they tend to just at rest feel worse than other people. And we know that a lot of the destructive or impulsive behaviors that people with BPD engage in, like self-injury, do serve emotion regulation functions. The literature is quite clear at that point. Also, many of us practice DBT, and we know that those treatments work, and those treatments like DBT are targeting emotion regulation processes. And research suggests that improving emotion regulation is a fundamental part of why those treatments are working. So thinking about BPD in this way and treating BPD in this way has been very helpful and has a lot of logic behind it. Where I think we start to run into some issues is that thinking about BPD only as an emotional disorder may not make perfect sense. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is there are many studies out there at this point, and I know because I've done some of them, and it's kind of a bummer to do this research and find null results, but there are many studies out there that don't provide empirical support for these emotion dysregulation components. Emotional reactivity in particular, as I said, has been tested pretty extensively. Most studies testing emotional reactivity in BPD suggest that people with BPD have the same magnitude of changes in their emotional intensity after a provocation or a stressor than other people. They don't have bigger reactions. There's some nuances and caveats to that, but on the whole, that's what the body of research suggests. Similarly, if you teach people with BPD strategies to regulate their emotions in a lab context, like teach them a mindfulness strategy, teach them distraction, teach them like an equivalent of check the facts, they can actually decrease their emotion to the same extent as other groups using those strategies. So at least when it comes to implementing a strategy that they're told to implement, they don't seem to have problems using it. It's important to note that they still have higher emotions than other people at the end of all of this because they have high baseline emotions. So they start higher, they end higher. But the extent to which their emotions rise following provocation and decrease following regulation tends to look comparable to other groups. So they might actually be just as good at regulating their emotions than others, which is kind of awkward for those of us who have been operating in a solely biosocial framework for a while. That being said, where the research is mixed is dependent on the kinds of stressors used to measure these processes. So when people with BPD are brought into a lab and presented with a stressor, like a math task, and then we measure their emotional reactivity, they tend to look like everybody else. When they are brought into a lab and presented with an interpersonal stressor, like rejection or abandonment, that's when we see evidence of heightened emotional reactivity. So this got myself and my colleagues really thinking about, like, maybe these components of emotion dysregulation aren't pervasive, but they're nested within an interpersonal context. And we know that people with BPD's relationships are quite disrupted, that, people with BPD's relationships have less support, more arguments, they break down more, they have more violence, more repeated reconciliations and dissolutions, and generally just more distress and problems communicating. So there's quite robust literature at this point suggesting that there are interpersonal problems in BPD. And there are also studies that suggest that those interpersonal problems are quite important to the other elements of BPD symptoms. So 73% of the most lethal suicide attempts in BPD are precipitated by interpersonal events like breakups, conflicts with loved ones. Interpersonal stressors, like those breakups and conflicts, are some of the most robust predictors of self-injury or threats around suicide. And we also know that for people who recover from BPD, those who recover from BPD over 6 years are much more likely to be in non-distressed intimate relationships than those who do not. So people who are in supportive relationships, supportive, healthy relationships, tend to do better than people who are not. So this suggests to us that, there's something going on in relationships that's really fundamental in driving wellness and pathology in BPD. And we're not the first people to think this. Actually, this is kind of like the sort of most original ways that BPD has been conceptualized, although through more psychoanalytic or dynamic lenses. So psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theories have been long suggesting that the core of BPD is interpersonal or relational. Some models suggest that the way people understand themselves and other people are what's disrupted. That's that concept of mentalization that's quite important even now to mentalization-based therapy. Theories have emphasized expectations of threat or abandonment as core to BPD. Some theories have emphasized poor empathy, although I don't find the research on that to be particularly compelling. And this notion of splitting has been around for a really long time, this idea that people with BPD see some people as very good and some people as very bad. And you can see how some of those really early psychoanalytic ideas have permeated the diagnostic criteria for BPD and are still kind of like therefore showing up in how we even recognize and diagnose the disorder. So I think you could take relationships out of the circle of the 5 domains of dysregulation of BPD and put them in the middle and also make a really compelling story. You know, like there's so much research that suggests that social support is like one of the #1 predictors of emotional well-being across all kinds of problems. When our relationships are strong and healthy, we feel a lot better. And when our relationships are rocky and falling apart, we feel really emotionally dysregulated. I'm sure a lot of you that maybe aren't typically high in emotion dysregulation can think back to times when you were going through divorces, bad breakups, and think, wow, yeah, I did kind of feel and act like I had higher emotion dysregulation than I typically do during that time. It's very destabilizing. Paranoid ideation as a kind of cognitive dysregulation domain is fundamentally interpersonal. It involves thinking about other people. And just like our emotions help us form our identity, our relationships are critical in this way. Who are around, who we like, who we feel close to, who feels close to us. That is major in telling us who we think we are. So if our relationships are highly disrupted, it will be hard to form identity. And last, yes, impulsive or destructive behaviors like self-injury can serve emotion regulatory functions, but they can serve interpersonal functions too. We can do things to influence others or to communicate things, maybe not even intentionally, but significant others and therapists certainly have the potential to reinforce destructive or unhelpful behaviors. So we started to think about this idea that maybe there's more interpersonal, there's more to the puzzle than solely an emotional way of thinking about BPD. And the biosocial model actually does have some components of this, specifically in how it talks about the invalidating environment, this idea that an environment that rejects emotional communications or punishes emotional displays in early life transacts with a biologically vulnerable child over time to elicit emotion dysregulation. That is an interpersonal idea. It's just specific to the etiology of BPD, not the maintenance. So there's not a lot of information of how relational factors can influence the maintenance of BPD in adulthood relative to rather than its development in childhood. And there have been other researchers who have highlighted some transactional processes like this. So Alan Frazzetti's work is particularly notable in this way. He's talked about how people with BPD struggle to accurately express their emotions and are more likely to express secondary emotions rather than primary emotions that they're feeling, which leads to their significant others to invalidate them or get defensive or escalate or judge them or reject them. And over time, a transaction ensues that leads to more conflict and exacerbation of emotion dysregulation. So we've been working with couples a lot where one person has BPD. And I will say, I certainly experienced this in that context. There's a lot of inaccurate emotional expression that's driving conflict in these dyads. So I think a lot of those ideas make a ton of sense. What's missing at this point is some of those interpersonal extensions don't account for all the interpersonal problems that have been shown in the BPD research field. There's been a lot more research since Alan Frazzetti originally wrote that theory. I think it came out in like 2005. So there's kind of a need for a model that incorporates some of the up-to-date information about how we understand interpersonal processes in BPD and emotional processes in BPD. And again, there's not a lot of information about how interpersonal problems maintain rather than just cause BPD. There are psychoanalytic and dynamic framings that are very useful, but especially if you're used to thinking behaviorally, some of the constructs are not as precise in ways that makes them harder to define and figure out clinical targeting. So for example, there's a lot of mixed research on whether or not mentalization is elevated in BPD. Or is lower in BPD. And one of the reasons for that is because mentalization is defined in so many different ways that it's kind of hard to get clear on what the construct actually is. So that's the background. And that is what led us to develop the bias model. So I'm going to break that down and maybe then I'll pause for some questions. But the bias model was really our attempt to elucidate how one person's thinking, cognitions, emotions and behaviors, like somebody with BPDs, and their significant others thinking, cognitions, emotions, and behaviors can transact with each other, and how those transactions together can maintain BPD, how BPD can almost kind of live in a relationship and live in relationships between people as much as within somebody. So the bias model is framing BPD as an interpersonal emotional disorder. It's not inconsistent with biosocial ideas. It's just putting them in an interpersonal context. So this is essentially the core component. So I'm going to start with what's going on with the individual with BPD. So the first thing is that we think that people with BPD have a history of harmful relationships, invalidation, trauma, conflict in relationships not going very well. And that's leads them to develop what we're calling an interpersonal threat sensitivity. And what I mean by that is a sensitivity to the idea that people will hurt them in some way, hurt them, reject them, judge them, not love them, think that they're bad or evil or flawed, let them down due to this history. And there's probably many ways this can show up, but based on the research at this point, we identified two, which is an attentional bias and an appraisal bias. So what I mean by that is people with BPD are probably more likely to pick up potential signs of threat, signs that they're being disliked, judged, rejected. And they're also more likely to interpret things as signs of that. So that's the appraisal bias. We think it is those things, that interpersonal threat sensitivity, that elicits higher reactivity emotionally. So when people with BPD detect that something is going wrong interpersonally with somebody else, that's when we see heightened emotional reactivity or a bigger emotional reaction. And that's also when we see difficulties in how they actually communicate with other people. So maybe they're more likely to withdraw, shut down, express a secondary emotion, attack, criticize, lots of different ways that communication can go awry, but that's when their skills start to break down because it's being driven by this perception of threat. And similarly, emotions and communication problems can kind of interact with each other. So when your emotions are getting more and more dysregulated, your communication skills are going to break down further and vice versa. Then we see destructive behavior. So I'll just say self-injury as an example, but you could substitute lots of behaviors here that are destructive that we see in BPD. So, and there's a few reasons why we think it happens here. And there's kind of two main pathways. The first is kind of not news, that this destructive behavior can regulate emotion. So a lot of people, emotions go up, they self-injure, emotions come back down. It's a very kind of emotion regulatory standard pathway that most of us are aware of. But as I said earlier, destructive behavior can also serve communicative or interpersonal functions, like to communicate to others, to influence other people. I'm not suggesting this in a pejorative way, like in a people with BPD are manipulative or attention-seeking way. There is no evidence for that. But I am suggesting that, of course, our interpersonal relationships can reinforce things we do. We're all reinforced by people. If this were a live presentation and you were all sitting there nodding, I would be reinforced to keep talking. So that's an interpersonal function. Okay, so this is what we think is kind of going on in BPD, but these things are inherently interpersonal processes. And so there are things going on with people with BPD's significant others too. And this is, I think, part of the more novel part of the bias model is we're trying to parse that process as well. So what we think is going on with significant others is that they are their own people. They have their own learning histories. They are going to maybe have their own personal learning histories that have nothing to do with the person with BPD around what emotion means, what distress looks like, what conflict tends to look like. But they also have a history with the person with BPD. If somebody very close to you in the midst of your conflict attempted suicide, you're going to learn something about how safe it is to have conflict with that person in the future, and what it means to upset them and what signs of their emotion look like. We find a lot of significant others in our research to be very hypervigilant to signs of distress or emotion in the person with BPD because they're afraid of where it might lead them given their history with that person. So we think that that history leads them to develop their own beliefs. And these beliefs are much less specified, you'll see, because the research is much weaker in this area. We're studying it right now, but maybe they think my loved one with BPD can't handle distress. I can't share how I'm feeling because it'll upset them and they'll be incapable of handling that. Or I am dangerous to them, or I am clumsy. I always hurt them no matter what I do. I'm a bad person. Or they might think more pejorative things. They're manipulative, they're attention seeking. They're just doing this to get a rise out of me, which would make them less effective at both communicating and more reactive to the person with BPD. So significant others are going to have their own emotional reactions in response to signs of the person with BPD's emotion, in response to conflict, in response to signs that the person with BPD is interpreting threat. And they're going to have their own communication problems. Given this history, given the emotions that they're feeling, they might be more likely to avoid conflict or maybe more reactive and engage in conflict. So all of this together is going to contribute to major relationship breakdowns, to conflict, to, big gaps in intimacy and closeness in relationships. And that's probably part of also what makes significant others so powerful as reinforcers of destructive behavior. Because there's so many communication difficulties in these relationships, where significant others give care or withdraw conflict is particularly powerful. And if it's following destructive behavior, then they have contributed inadvertently to this system in a really potent way. So all of those things together feed back into these learning histories in terms of what people are learning about themselves, other people, their relationship, what's safe, what's not safe. And we think kind of creates a vicious cycle that can keep BP alive and going. There's much more that I want to say, but maybe I will just take, if there's like one or two questions here before I go on, I'm happy to pause and answer those.
Oh, there aren't any questions yet. One question was about just asking if you'd be willing to share slides.
I will, yes.
Okay.
I will send that to Livia after for, does that work for you, Livia? If I send it to you after?
Yeah, of course. And I can email them out to
Great.
people who participated. I guess one question I had, if it's okay for me to ask now, is that good?
Yeah.
Is, some of this, I'm just, I'm thinking a lot of labels are floating through my head, like CPTSD, PTSD, like it sounds like some of this, like hypervigilance and like worry about distrust is very overlapping with a post-traumatic response.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if that can inform intervention, or like, I'm imagining you get that question a good amount.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly comes up quite a bit. And I think one of the things that's tricky, especially when it comes to CPTSD, is the diagnostic criteria for CPTSD and the construct is very overlapping with BPD. And I know that it's very controversial around like, are they two different things? Are they kind of part of the same thing? It's a very difficult question to answer. Research is very mixed at this point. And probably part of that is because BPD is itself not one thing and not particularly well conceptualized and defined diagnostically, given the way the criteria currently are. But I think that kind of makes it a little bit difficult to parse, like, okay, well, is this a trauma response or not? Probably for some people it is. And for a lot of folks that end up with a CPTSD diagnosis, this does fit. And people who don't get a PTSD diagnosis but have BPD, this does fit as well. Like one of the, I think, issues with PTSD for people with BPD is that the hallmark PTSD symptoms of re-experiencing and avoidance are not always present in people with BPD who don't meet criteria for kind of straight PTSD, but they're still really reactive to signs of invalidation or to things that remind them of difficult interpersonal experiences. So I think this model actually captures some of that without pushing people out who actually don't fit within the PTSD box. And I think it could really apply to people who have PTSD who are reacting to signs of threat, like as in like trauma reminders, and are having kind of emotional reactivity, and then are regulating that through destructive behavior in response to the trauma reminders. So I guess big picture is like, I kind of think it does apply to like all those groups, but then like, how would I parse it across the groups? I think it's really difficult to say right now, because it's still not really clear to me how those groups can be parsed at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. There's one question there, so I'll answer that. What is the relationship between BPD with suicidality and violence to others, not just to self? Yeah, so intimate partner violence especially is highly associated. It's like very common in the relationships of people with BPD, often bidirectional. That a lot of these folks with BPD, when they are dysregulated, aren't just harming themselves, they can harm other people too. And those things can be emotion dysregulation driven, and can probably be in it. And I'm not suggesting that like victims of violence are responsible for this violence, but there can be contingencies in those relationships too. If somebody gets upset that someone brings something up and lashes out or threatens that person, and then that person withdraws or backs off, that the first person is going to learn that that behavior is effective in kind of meeting some sort of need for them. So I think that that kind of behavior can fit within this model too, although more research is probably needed. I'll just do this last question, and then I will press on. Do you find that individuals with BPD and their SOs involved in your research find this model to be validating, similarly to the way the biosocial is typically? Yeah, I do. So far, I do find this, find this model can be validating for folks. It's also very complex. So when we explain it to people, I don't go through this level of detail and technicality. Like I don't talk about attentional versus appraisal biases, and the specific, like all the bidirectional arrows, like that's a lot for people. So I break it down a lot more simply around like, you're afraid of getting hurt based on your history, and you kind of pay attention to signs of that, and it hurts more when you see signs of that than maybe it might hurt somebody else. And then we talk a lot about how the way that one person's emotions and communications influence the other, and how they transact over time. And I find that dyads find that very validating, to feel like their whole pattern is understood in the way that they transact. The question about Alan Frazzetti's transactional model is really important. I'm going to answer that maybe in a few slides, but I appreciate that question. So I will be back to the question and answer box soon, but I want to make sure we get through some other pieces. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about empirical support at this point. I don't think I have to talk a lot about the empirical support for the idea that people with BPD have a history of harmful relationships. Pretty clear that people with BPD often have invalidated, disruptive early life relationships, abuse and neglect, childhood trauma. And there's evidence that they have a lot of conflict in adult relationships. They tend to have fewer relationships, but they tend to be more intense, closer, but also more likely to dissolve. There is, at this point, good meta-analytic research that shows that people with BPD are more likely to attend to negative or threatening information in general, in like a scene, but they're especially more likely to do that when it's interpersonal. And when you present people with BPD with interpersonal information, like neutral faces, they're more likely to read those faces as angry or negative. They're also more likely to suggest that people aren't trustworthy, and to expect rejection from people. And it makes sense, right? Given their learning history, they have been rejected. A lot of them have been abused. So they get very good at reading people's faces for signs of anger, for signs that something bad might be happening. But to that point around trauma, the way that generalizes when they go into relationships that are maybe not as abusive becomes less helpful. I already said that there's evidence that emotional reactivity in BPD is specific to interpersonal stress and stimuli. So I'll just kind of gloss over that for now. But just to say that there's also evidence that people with BPD's communication really does break down more than other people's under conditions of heightened emotion. So when you elicit emotion in different groups of people, all of our communication skills get worse. It's hard to communicate when we're upset, but that's especially true for BPD. They become particularly ineffective in how they talk to other people and how they think through interpersonal problems when emotion rises. It's particularly corrosive to those interpersonal skills for them. In terms of the functions of destructive behavior, like self-injury, it's a little bit hard to kind of talk about that in generalities because it's more studied kind of behavior by behavior, but it is particularly well documented with self-injury that self-injury can have both emotion regulation functions and interpersonal functions, and that both of those things happen, but BPD predicts a higher likelihood of having both functions for self-injury, not just emotional, but also interpersonal functions. So that's kind of some like a quick drive-by of the evidence for the BPD side of this. There's like this whole other side. And so if anyone is thinking, well, what about the significant others? It's an excellent question. And the honest answer is like, we know so much less about what's going on with significant others. It's really sad. All we really know at this point is they are highly distressed, that they have a lot of grief, a lot of burden, depression. There's some evidence that they might be more likely to avoid difficult conversations and emotions than other folks. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is they're often aware of what's going on with the person with BPD. They're aware of suicide attempts. And in one study, about almost 70% of significant others of people with BPD expressed that they wanted support for their own mental health following somebody with BPD's suicide attempt and weren't able to get it. So this is like a huge unmet need. That is not nearly as adequately addressed as it needs to be. But that's basically what we know about significant others. So we are in my lab doing a study to actually monitor how do significant others respond to suicide and self-injury attempts and communications with people with BPD. What do they do right before? What do they do after? Are there things that they're doing that are inadvertently reinforcing? What's going on with their own well-being? We're trying to parse all of that out right now in some of our research. So if anyone has any participants that they can send our way, please do, because I think that that's going to be really important and really helpful for significant others to start to get information on like, what can we do? What can we do that is actually helpful here versus not helpful, and what needs that they have. So I just want to answer a couple bias model questions before I talk about some intervention ideas. Alan Frizzetti has offered a transactional model and a step-by-step analysis. Bias appears to overlap. Have you considered ways to integrate this? Yeah, thank you. Yes. So I mentioned that earlier, but Alan Frizzetti's work has been like totally foundational in this area, especially, as I said, the way he talks about inaccurate recognition of emotion. I don't think that our model is at odds with those ideas. I think that that model doesn't fully account for some of the research that we've been trying to integrate around threat sensitivity and appraisal and attentional biases that's been kind of coming out again and again and again. So we wanted to kind of highlight potential cognitive pieces in both people with BPD and significant others. That being said, if you're thinking more from the transactional model perspective, a lot of it is going to be very, very cohesive. Like that is going to give you a lot of inroads for how to coach people with BPD to identify primary emotions and express those, how to coach significant others to validate and reinforce that. One thing that I wanted to also say is that we really try and think about in our work the relationship as our client, not the person with BPD. So we've really moved away from thinking about intervention as bringing significant others in to assist the person with BPD's intervention, so much as intervening for significant others and people with BPD and their relationship all at the same time, all of them with equal needs and equally important components in these models. So I think that the bias model gives us some space to really flesh out those significant other pieces too. But they're very, very, very cohesive. And certainly in the bias model paper, like definitely Alan Frizzetti's work is like the most cited article that is coming up in that paper. So for the context of the SO, the chain of behavior is present primarily in the context of the relationship of the persons with BPD, and in other relationships, you wouldn't see this behavior, whereas for the individual with BPD, you're going to see this chain across various interpersonal contexts. Fascinating question. That is an empirical question that I don't have the answer to at this point. If I'm going to think really systemically, I think that there are reasons that people with BPD and partners tend to work well together. based on their own learning histories and cognitive histories, I think that, a lot of people are going to, they gravitate towards people who will work with them in behavioral patterns that they are used to and that are familiar to them. So I don't know that that's necessarily true. But like I said, we don't know anything about SOs, so I have no idea what their relationships otherwise look like. Our clients who have GAD seem to almost always present as having anxiety specific to relationships versus general anxiety. Any thoughts on this? Yes, thank you for that question. I am not a GAD expert, but my general thoughts writ large philosophically is that we completely underestimate the importance of social support and interpersonal relationships to all kinds of psychopathology. Most of us are trained as individual interventionists, like, psychologists, for example, are very, very individually focused. But in my grand vision of what the world looks like, which is like not something that I personally am going to accomplish, communities are shaped to support people's mental health. And psychologists and individual therapy is really not a first line approach for mental health, because relationships are massively powerful. And I think that they are more important to most conditions than we acknowledge, and a huge blind spot. Yeah. BIAS stands for the Borderline Interpersonal Affective Systems Model. Okay, I'm going to talk about intervention ideas. What am I doing time-wise? Okay, not so bad. All right, okay, so this is my plug for why thinking about treating BPD as both an emotional and an interpersonal disorder is a good idea. I have a lot of reasons, so get ready. Here we go. Number one, existing interventions need to be optimized in terms of their efficiency and their outcomes. I love DBT, that's my home base. So this is not meant to be slander to DBT or MBT or all of the great BPD interventions that are out there, but most of us know we have a massive scalability issue. Wait lists are super long because our treatments require many components, a lot of training, and take a long time to deliver. And we really have to figure this out. It's like an emergency. People are literally dying on wait lists. So we have to find ways of treating BPD faster. I think that if we are hitting emotional targets and interpersonal targets at the same time, that might be the way to speed up the outcomes and to possibly even optimize outcomes, because we're getting both the targets at the same time instead of just one of them. The other thing that's really exciting about thinking about treating BPD in the context of relationships is you might be able to shape relationships in a way that maintains therapy gains more effectively. Because if you're not just working with the person with BPD, but the interpersonal context that they're nested within, that context may be become more supportive and reinforcing of adaptive, skillful behavior that can maintain gains over time. Whoops. As I said before, significant others really need help. So we can develop more therapies for significant others, or we can develop therapies that are dyadic and can maybe address those targets and address the person with BPD's well-being all the same one, like a 3-for-1. I think my last argument to this point is there's also potential for broader psychosocial outcomes. So if you work with a couple, like a couple where one person has BPD, and work on improving both partners' mental health and their relationship functioning, you also have the potential to improve their kids' functioning and well-being as a result of working on those broader systems. Yes, okay, this is my last point. A recent meta-analysis suggested that DBT does not improve suicidal ideation relative to control conditions. Suicidal behaviors, absolutely. Self-injury, absolutely. But we are having a hard time moving the needle on ideation. And that's probably very important to maintenance of long-term gains and people's general kind of suffering. So one potential thought is like, maybe if we're hitting more interpersonal targets at the same time, we could try and move the needle on suicidal ideation a little bit more. So for all those reasons, our team has started to develop an intervention that we're calling SAGE. And people always ask what it stands for. It stands for nothing. I'm done with acronyms. People never know what anything stands for. Even the question about the bias model proves this. Its acronyms are, I think there's too many acronyms in our field. We used to call it COMPASS, which was an acronym, but we've changed it. This is inspired off like the idea of the sagebrush plant, which is a plant that communicates with other plants. It's like a really interpersonal plant. It sends signals to those plants to keep them safe. It sends nurturants to wildlife and plants around it, and it gets it from those around it. So essentially, this is a plant that heals or hurts together with what's around it. And that's essentially the essence of this intervention and this idea that people can hurt together, people can heal together, that we're all kind of bound up together. So SAGE is a conjoint therapy. Right now, we've been testing it with couples, but we're hoping to branch it out to other types of relationships too. That's for people with BPD who are suicidal and or self-harming, and their significant others. That is really, we're trying to design it to target BPD, relationship functioning, and significant other mental health all at the same time, based on the bias model. It's 12 sessions. We're trying to keep it as short as possible because we are thinking about that scalability issue. And it has 3 stages. So the first stage is really focused on orientation and really safety, like safety in the relationship, decreasing intense conflict, but also safety from self-injury and suicidal ideation. The next stage focuses on communication and emotion regulation. And the third stage focuses on cognitive interventions and termination, so beliefs. So if we go back to the bias model, the first stage is really focused on these components that are really like hovering around the destructive behavior. So we'll do safety planning, and it's all dyadic. So not only do people with BPD learn what to do to keep themselves safe, partners learn how they can help or talk to the person about safety concerns, also how they can take care of their own distress in crises like that. We teach them skills to de-escalate from intense conflict and disengage from highly intense conflict with each other. So thinking kind of like sort of like an interpersonal distress tolerance section. And then we start to move out. So in phase 2, we start to teach people to regulate emotions dyadically. So how they can work together as a team to get emotions down, how they can share emotions with each other, identify them, validate them. We start to work on contingencies like changing patterns around potential reinforcement of destructive behaviors, of passivity, of factors that keep emotion dysregulation going. All that happens in phase 2. And then finally, we move into these like cognitive elements in phase 3, where we actually get couples to learn skills to challenge beliefs that they have about themselves, other people, and emotions as a team. So how to look at beliefs as a team and brainstorm, like, is this actually a helpful way of thinking about them? So every exercise that we do is dyadic in nature. They are all designed to bring people closer together and to have them kind of uniting as a team and pushing back against sort of BPD, as opposed to pitting the significant other against the person with BPD. We want to externalize all these problems and get the couple to kind of come together and collaborate on how to recover from this. And we're not just working on the person with BPD's beliefs here, significant others also focus on targeting beliefs that they have, which they may have learned from the relationship of the person with BPD or from elsewhere. So how much time do I have? I'm going to just talk for 2 minutes, but if it works, and then I'm going to stop talking and answer questions. So does it work? That's a great question. I hope so, but I do not know is the answer. We have done a 5 dyad case series, and we are now in the midst of doing an uncontrolled trial, which has like a larger sample size. If you're in Ontario and you have couples that may be interested in joining our uncontrolled trial, they can email to reply@yorku.ca. We are still recruiting. But I'm going to skip over this and just tell you that the couples who come into the study have BPD and either have elevated suicidal ideation or engage in self-injury and suicide attempts. We do exclude couples who have severe intimate partner violence in the past year. At this early stage, but I'm hoping over time we can include that because it's actually quite common. I'm just going to show you, I know this is like a real drive-by, but I'm just going to show you some really brief kind of new primary outcomes from SAGE before I wrap up and take questions. So in the case series, 4 out of 5 couples completed the intervention. 1 couple dropped out after session 10, which was a bit of a surprise, but I can speak to that if people have questions. And ratings of satisfaction on the intervention have been high. So out of 32, both people with BPD and their partners on average rated their satisfaction at a 29.75. So that's pretty decent. Before I show you any outcomes, please note that this is anecdata. This is 4 couples because we don't have post data from the 5th couple that dropped out. So it is pretty impossible to know what this means at this stage. We really have to hold the outcomes with a bit of a grain of salt. But in terms of the people with BPD, in our measurements of BPD severity, 3 out of 4 had clinically reliable improvement. So reliable, like beyond measurement error improvement in BPD severity, including their partners reporting that they have that improvement. 3 out of 4 had improvement in suicidal ideation, including 2 of their partners reporting that they had that improvement, 2 suggesting that they didn't change, and 2 reported improvement in conflict. You'll notice over here, there's this person who is showing worsening outcomes, like reliable beyond measurement error worsening outcomes. All of that is from the same person. And we know that they had a very major relationship breakdown after the intervention before the post-assessment that we think might have contributed. But again, this is something that we're just watching as we're in our early stages of testing. In terms of self-injury and suicide, 1 case went from 11 self-injurious acts in the past 6 weeks to 2. Another one went from 2 to 0. Another one went from 0 to 0. And another one, again, as I was talking about with that case, went from 0 to 3. I want to take questions. So I'm going to wrap up now. I have more outcomes, but I just want to say that that's very, 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 very preliminary sneak peek kind of data. I will say, again, that study is still recruiting, and we're recruiting across North America for couples where one person has BPD to just study these interpersonal processes. So throwing any referrals to either of those studies would be totally appreciated if you have couples that you work with or people that you work with that might be interested. But my take home that I really want to leave people with is that BPD really wedges itself in between people and in their relationships. And relationships are where it's hurting for a lot of people. And I think that they're amazingly powerful in terms of where they can help people heal and recover too. So I think that there's so much for us to leverage here. I think it gives us lots of new treatment opportunities, and significant others really need our help too. There's a lot of mental health concerns and distress and fear and shame in these significant others that even if you don't want to work dyadically, could really use some clinical attention. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that and turn to answering question. Insurance pays according to the disease, not to the relationship as the client. That's a good point. I'm not in the US, so I don't work in the kind of healthcare system that I think probably a lot of the American attendees are working for. But I'd be curious. I know that there are other conjoint interventions that do bill under the diagnosis because this is designed to be a treatment for BPD. It is also a treatment for these other things. So I'm not sure what that looks like in terms of billing because I'm not well versed in the system. But certainly CBCT for PTSD providers, there might be some information on that website, which is Couple Therapy for PTSD. Yes, I can send the recruitment flyer with the slides. I do not offer trainings in SAGE because we have to figure out if it works first. But if it works, yes, I will be disseminating, I promise. Okay, you'll be hearing from me. For the greatest impact, at what stage of treatment would a referral make sense? For example, would the client need to be finished with the 6 months DBT skills group before we could consider a referral to SAGE? We are allowing people to be in other therapies, but like I said, we consider SAGE a BPD treatment. So we don't require people to have gone through any treatment beforehand. They can have, and they can be in treatment at the same time. But we want this to be a treatment that stands alone because we want it to be scalable. We do not do coaching between sessions for many reasons with SAGE. Part of it, again, is scalability. We're trying to pare down a lot of what we do in the development, but also when you're working with relationships, you have skills coaches for each other built in. So you have these opportunities for each partner of a couple to coach each other and reinforce each other, prompt each other. I think you have to be careful because you don't want to turn one partner into a caretaker. And there's a lot of those kinds of processes going on in these relationships, but you have a natural reinforcement opportunity in these dyads. And I do find that homework compliance is much higher because there's like another person there saying, oh, we have to do our homework today. Are there any thoughts about how to use this for those in a DBT framework? Yes. I was speaking about this just yesterday. I think there's a lot of ways we can think about DBT skills through a more systemic lens. So when we teach interpersonal effectiveness, we can teach our clients, like, how do you shape your partners to validate you? How do you explain that to them and talk to them about why invalidation is hard and why you need validation? And you can kind of shape them in that way. When we teach distress tolerance, we can not just say tip skills, but recognize that a lot of these crises are happening in the midst of an interpersonal crisis and context. So how do you disengage from a conflict? Like, how do you take a time out and tell someone, I'm getting out of this conversation and going and practicing a tip skill? Probably we should be embedding some of that training because that is when people are using it. It's not that hard to use a tip skill when you're kind of by yourself and there's no stressor in front of you. I mean, it is hard, but it's not nearly as hard as it is when you're like in the middle of something interpersonally. The last thing that I wanted to say is that one thing that I think I really like about how we've designed the SAGE homework is we've really tried to make everything as dyadic as possible. So a lot of the homework is not just about practicing skills, it's about catching your loved one practicing the skills to create more intimacy, but also more opportunities for like natural reinforcement to arise. Like, oh, you validated me. Like, I noticed I'm supposed to write down when you validated me and you validated me. Like, thank you. Okay, I caught that. So now I can reinforce that. And I'm like attending deliberately to non-threatening interpersonal cues. And I'm building kind of intimacy and reinforcing your skills use all at the same time. So when you are working with significant others, even if you're just bringing them into one session, it's a really good idea to think about, like, how can you shape them, each person in a dyad, to be catching the skills use and reinforcing the skills use of each other instead of just attending to the signs where things are breaking down, which is historically what people tend to do. Oh, there's more. Okay, I think I probably have time for one more. What might be the implications of this for supporting a college campus, such as roommates, teammates, friends who are living with and or supporting a person with BPD? I'm thinking more about a public health approach that may not involve disclosing a diagnosis, but rather general skills. Oh, wow. I mean, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think a great public health approach is just teaching people about validation and teaching people how to validate. A colleague of mine works with sexual assault survivors because there's research that shows that the way people respond to a disclosure of sexual assault can really predict whether or not that person develops PTSD. And just shaping communities and supporters like friends to just allow that person, that survivor, to have emotions and not say, I'm going to distract you, can have this like significant impact on recovery. So I think that kind of applies in this context too. Like, allowing people to have feelings and validate them is not something most people know how to do. And it would be massively transformative if communities actually just did that at default. Okay, I know it's one. I could go on forever. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you for being with us.